On that note, I think it's time to begin. I'm going to welcome back my colleague, Shoma Podar. Shoma was with us on the 10th of July when she took us through the brilliant four skills approach to develop 21st century reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Today, she's going to be focusing on developing reading skills within the context of the integrated skills in English. And she's going to be showing us both technique as well as some resources for you to imbibe and impart in your classroom practice. I wish you the most enjoyable, enriching, and fulfilling 45 minutes to go. Shoma, all yours.
Thank you so much, Dale. Thank you so much. And I think I have to live up to that expectation now. So without further ado, a very good evening, everyone, and welcome to this series of webinars conducted by Trinity College London, India. It's absolutely amazing to be back here again, and we really can't thank you enough for your support and your invaluable feedback. And like Dale has mentioned, it will really help us grow, and it really does mean the world to us. So keep it coming. I think some of you had attended the webinar on the 10th of July, where I spoke about how we can teach all four skills the 21st century way in the modern classroom. So now what we are going to do is we're going to look at skills separately according to different levels. In today's webinar, for example, I'm going to focus only on reading skills with at CEFR levels A2 to B2, which would typically be your middle school students, high school students, and young adults. I would also like to focus a little bit on the reading process and the various sub-skills that constitute reading, and most importantly, how we can incorporate these sub-skills into our daily lessons in our classrooms, irrespective of how we are teaching, whether we are teaching online or in a face-to-face scenario. Now, I will be referring to the integrated skills in English, or the ISE, which is a 4 skills qualification from Trinity College London, as an example to show how we can attempt certain reading tasks, certain reading questions. But if you're not familiar with the ISE exam, don't despair. I'm just using this as a model. So all you need to do is relate it back to your experience and the kind of exams you're preparing your learners for, which could be a CBSE exam or an ICSE or any reading and writing exam. In this context, it would make sense to have a look at the ISE handbook, which is a very clear and concise way to guide your teaching of all 4 skills. So I would request my colleagues to share this on the chat box with you, and you can have a look at it later in your free time. Right. So when we talk about reading, what we really want our learners to be able to develop is a good and sound knowledge of reading of different kinds of texts, of maybe shorter and simpler texts at lower levels and slightly longer, complex and more abstract texts at higher levels. We would also want them to be able to have a general idea about the main ideas, a general meaning of what the text or an infographic is about, and also to be able to connect the main idea at paragraph level with the main idea at the text level, or a macrostructure understanding of the text, and also to be able to identify specific factual information at sentence levels as well. Along with that, it is important that our students also learn to be able to identify key information at facts of a text or an infographic, and also to be able to identify contextual clues in order to be able to infer or deduce meaning of a text. And last but not the least, to also be able to compare and contrast information from multiple texts from different sources and use or curate or synthesize that information in order to write maybe a short overview or a summary in their own words. So this is the kind of framework we want our learners to develop, and this is the kind of framework we use for ISE as well. And like I had mentioned in the earlier webinar, all these sub-skills need individual attention. So we know what it is we are practicing with our students, and then we put it back into the bigger picture, which could be an exam task or an ICC question or a CBC exam. Now, traditionally, reading has always been seen as an individual skill, which it is. But if you break it down into smaller parts, into the nuts and bolts of sub-skills, it is hugely beneficial, not just for teachers, but also for our learners. Teachers, you can plan an entire lesson around these sub-skills. And if you show a visual like this to your students, they will understand why you want to spend more time doing reading activities in the class as opposed to giving them maybe a homework or a home assignment or giving them multiple choice questions to answer. So this is something that helps both teachers as well as students. And I'm soon going to show you how to incorporate these sub-skills in your daily lessons through activities. But while we're on the subject of how we can help our students comprehend reading better, it's important to make this very important distinction between two different kinds of reading. One which is reading for pleasure, or Harry Potter reading, as we say, or reading of narrative texts, versus reading expository texts, which are information texts. So our learners start reading stories or narrative texts from a very young age. These are nothing but stories with imaginative language and emotions. Expository texts, on the other hand, are the exact opposite of narrative texts because they are heavy on facts. Information is often longer in more complex structures. And this is the kind of text that stays with our students for a huge chunk of their lives in through schools, colleges, universities, and sometimes even at work. Now, one mistake that we make as teachers is in assuming that just because a student or a learner is a prolific reader of fiction or narrative text, they will automatically have a good handle on expository text. And that's not necessarily true. This may be partly because of the fact that expository texts, each expository text have different text structures. For example, some texts can have the main idea first and then subsidiary ideas, or the cause first and then the effects, or effects first and then the cause, or two different point of views, etc. And this is what can throw them off. So it makes sense for us to help our students recognize different kinds of text structures as early as possible, sometimes as early as in class 4 or 5, where they start getting exposed to expository text through science or social studies or different kinds of different other subjects, and not just English. So how do we teach our students expository text structures? How do we teach, say, middle school students these structures? So what you could do is maybe show them something like this, that expository text can broadly be divided into description, sequence text, compare and contrast, cause and effect, problem and solution text. And then what you could do is give them some sample reading passages, very short ones, very simple, to go along with, to correspond with each expository text structure. And you may also want to highlight or introduce the signal words that go along with each expository text. So if you're doing a compare and contrast text, the language that, the signal words that come along with it would be however, although, but, etc. So when students see this, there is a connect between the text structure as well as the language that goes with each text. And the third thing that you could do is also introduce graphic organizers, especially if it is a young learner, say in class 4 or 5, and they're new to these kinds of texts. graphic organizers would look like this. Now, if you show a template like this and give them new text to analyze, maybe in groups or in pairs, it'll be easy for them to put information in these boxes and make sense of what they're reading. Now, as much as I want to spend more time on this, unfortunately, I won't be able to do that. So I'm going to ask my colleagues to share two very important documents with you on the chat box. And they're very simple and easy to understand. They will help you to introduce these structures. They've got sample reading passages, and please feel free to use your own course books from different subjects to correspond with these text structures. And you also have these graphic organizers in the document. You can use it to your advantage, as well as the signal words with each text structure. Now, my humble request is that you start it as early as possible, and I don't mean it badly. Don't wait till students get to secondary school and then introduce something like this, because by then it's not as though it's too late. By then, the fear of reading already sets in, and it is kind of counterproductive for everyone, for you as well as for your students. So even if it is a little bit of work, it would make sense to introduce these text structures at the soonest. Right. So coming to ISE, I have discussed the format of the exam in the earlier webinar, so I'm not going to do that again. I'm going to focus only on reading for the reading and writing module, which is, so the first task in the reading module is your long reading task. And like you can see, it's again an expository text, it's an information text, more straightforward, something your students are familiar with. And students have to answer 15 questions based on their understanding of this text. The other task in ISE, which is task 2 for your reading and writing section, is a very unique task, and it's reflective how modern readers read. So you have 3 or 4 different texts, different discrete texts, and they all have something in common. So there is an underlying thematic connection. There's also an infographic in the text. Now, they all have different writer's bias, different text structures, and candidates have to answer 15 questions based on their understanding of these 3 or 4 texts. This is also a lead-in to the writing task, which is task 3, or this is when students have to curate information from the 3 or 4 texts that they've read and use that to answer a writing prompt. So typically, the kind of questions that you have in the ISE exam, the reading tasks would be title matching, selecting true statements. We don't have selecting false statements. Gap fills in the form of completing summary notes and completing statements. We also have something called multiple matching, which is where you have to choose which question refers to which text. Now, a lot of these questions, or some of these questions, I think you're already practicing for many different kinds of exams. Now, the fact of the matter is that in order to be able to answer any of these questions, you need to have a good handle on sub-skills, which is why it makes sense to get your students to really understand how to go about these sub-skills, and then you go back to whatever reading task you're doing with your students. So without further ado, let's have a look at the sub-skills and how we can introduce it in the classroom. Now, the first 2 are speed reading sub-skills, extremely important because they kind of work in tandem and they help you cover large amounts of text in a very short time. Skimming refers to looking at a material very quickly in order to get a general meaning, the main idea of that passage or that text. And like you can see in the picture of a stone being skimmed on the surface of the water, the stone barely touches the surface of the water. It doesn't go into the depths of the water. Similarly, when you're skimming, you're not really reading word for word. You're trying to get an idea of what the text is about. So our learners, our millennials, are supposed to be expert skim readers because they are exposed to a lot of material courtesy of the internet from a very young age. And but the thing is, there is a fine balance between how quickly you read a text and how well you've understood it. So this is where teachers need to step in, because it's our job to help them make sense of what they're reading. So important is skimming as an effective reading tool that the first 5 questions in ISE test a candidate's ability to be able to skim read a text through tasks like title matching and multiple matching. So how do we teach our students how to skim a text? I'm sure you're already doing this with your students, but if you're not, let's have a quick look at what we can do, the steps that we need to remember. The first thing you need to do is read the introduction very, very carefully. That is where the author introduces the main thesis or the main idea of the passage. The second thing you need to do is pay very, very careful attention to the first and the last sentence of each paragraph. And students must know that the topic sentence expresses the main idea of each paragraph, and that the topic sentence can be in the first or the last sentence. So you need to peel your eyes for the first and the last sentence. You also need to be careful about typographical cues, change in fonts and headings and subheadings, because these are like your roadmap and they'll take you to your main idea eventually. You also want to have a look at verbs and adjectives and proper nouns in the text, because again, these are like your roadmap. They will take you to your main idea. And last but not the least, you also need to read the conclusion very, very carefully, because this is where the author is trying to tie the loose ends, is going to give you a recap of the entire passage. So if you've missed out something, this is your cue to go back to the reading passage and have a look at it carefully. So when you introduce these steps to your students, the process, they will see the process of skimming. They will understand the method that's needed in order to read a text properly and not just read it aimlessly in order to get to the main idea. So there's a lot of research, a lot of modern research on how we skim read, on how we read, because we're reading differently, and we're reading a lot more now than ever before. And eye tracking is a research on how efficient or skilled readers read, how much time skilled readers spend on certain parts of the text. And studies have shown that efficient readers make fewer jumps and shorter fixations. So what are fixations? Fixations are when you lay your eyes on certain parts of the text. Now, poor readers make more frequent jumps and longer fixations. Studies have shown that efficient readers take in groups of words as they read along, and they don't read word for word. They do not obsess word for word. So this brings us to collocations. And we all know what collocations are. They're groups of words that go together. For example, excruciating pain and not excruciating joy, or bread and butter, or heavy rain and not strong rain, even though the latter is grammatically correct. So when you see one word, you would know what the next word or the next couple of words would be. And that is a very useful tool for skimming or scanning, because it helps you to predict what the next couple of words would be like. So collocation, in a nutshell, is at the heart of reading fluency. And thankfully, it can be taught at lower grades as well. And it's not just something, a tool that you need for reading. It will come to good use when they're listening or speaking. And generally, to expand their repertoire of a language. Now, how do we teach collocations? So what you could do is maybe start with a base word, any base word. Say you could start off with get or a make or do. And then what you can see on the screen, the mind map, is something that you can try with your lower level learners. So you choose a word like get or do, and you do a little bit of brainstorming with your students. Now, one word of caution here, in the first couple of classes, the input has to be more from your side, because chances are that your students may not know the meanings or the permutations and combinations of different words. So they may know get married or get upset or get a cold, but chances are that class 4 or 5 students wouldn't know what the meaning of get yourself together is or get on with it. So this is where we step in and we introduce the different meanings of the words to our students. There is a little bit of memorization that needs to be done at this stage, and that's fine. And you can make them maybe jot down the meanings of the collocations in their notebooks and go back and forth with it. It needs a little bit of practice, a little bit of repetition, because it may not be possible for them to remember every word. The other activity which I find quite effective in a reading class is when you, as a pre-reading exercise, you give your students a text and you can ask them to find out the collocations in the text, and they can do it work maybe in pairs or in groups. And then you and the whole class, they can try and find out the meanings of the collocations in the reading text, or they can refer to their dictionaries if they want. This makes it a little more contextual because they see the meanings of those collocations in terms of the reading text as well. I'm going to come back to this again when I do scanning, because collocation is really useful, and like I've mentioned, it's important for all skills. So coming to the next few, a couple of more activities and tools that you can do in your reading lessons, in your reading class. easyprompter.com is an amazing software that is perfect for young students, say maybe class 4 and 5 students, where you really need to get them to read something quickly. So what you could do is you just copy and paste the reading passage onto the software, and you choose the pace or the speed at which you want your students to read. So the text appears and disappears according to how quickly or how slowly you want your students to read the text. So this may not always be possible in a face-to-face classroom, but teaching online has definitely got certain advantages, because this is something that they have to read quickly, because the text will have disappeared and they won't have a chance to go back to it again. So they have to read quickly. You could give it, it's absolutely brilliant if you're doing it with lower level learners, a speed reading technique that you really want to them to master. Newsinlevels.com again is brilliant for lower level learners, because at this level, you really want your students to be interested in what kind of reading tasks they want to do, the kind of reading passages they're reading. So this website has got news articles, semi-authentic text, and the best part is you can again choose which level, what question. You also can choose the speed, and then you share your screen with your students and they can have a go at beautiful reading passages. Another thing that I quite like about this website is there are listening activities as well. So for each news item, there are listening files. You can practice that first, do a dictogloss, or you can start with reading first and then go to listening. It's entirely your call. Another activity you could do is matching headings to paragraphs. This is very easy to do. So all you need to do is maybe cut up a text into different paragraphs, and students have to match the headings to the paragraphs. Now, the thing is, headings are nothing but an expression of the main idea. So they have to skim the text. So you're kind of tricking them into reading or skim reading to get to get to the main idea. And you can also make them work in pairs and get them to race with their friends. So that will definitely help them to read quickly, not read for word to word, and get to the main idea at the soonest. Another variation of this activity is where you give a selection without a title, and students have to come up with creative titles for a passage or a text, and you can step in to judge which title is the most creative. But you have to remember that it's not just about coming up with a creative title. Title has to encapsulate the main idea of the reading passage as well. So this far, whatever I've discussed is to get students to practice activities, practice with activities, keeping in mind how you need to read the text quickly. But like I had mentioned, you also have to remember that efficacy of understanding is just as important as reading a text quickly. So another activity that you could do, which I had mentioned in the previous webinar, is a tags exercise. So for this exercise, for whatever reading passage you give, they have to do maybe a 1 or 2 sentence title, the author's purpose, the genre of the text, as well as a 1 or 2 sentence summary for every paragraph. So what this helps them do is to make them aware of what they're reading instead of reading aimlessly. And it's also going to be easy for them to connect the dots as they read further on. And I'm going to refer to this again when I do careful reading. They're all interconnected, but from experience, I can tell you that there may be a little bit of resistance initially because it's a little bit of work, but it's definitely going to help them in the long run. It's definitely going to help them to make sense of what they're reading. Right, so coming to the next subskill. Scanning is just as important as skimming, and like I've mentioned, they work in tandem, and scanning helps you to go through a large amount of text in a short time. So you let your eyes fall on large portions of the text, and you pull out specific information, specific data or numbers or words from the text. Most students are comfortable doing skimming exercises where they just have to get the general idea of a reading passage. But if you ask them to scan, they'll either read word for word or they'll read it very quickly. And that kind of defeats the purpose of speed reading. So it's important for us to show them how to scan a text. We have to make our learners aware of the fact that when they're scanning, the brain is in search mode. So they are searching more and reading less. So they have to let go of this temptation to read everything and understand the meaning of everything, which is why we need to teach them techniques as to how to go about with scanning. So the first thing that you need to do is have a look at the structure of the text. If it is something quite long, then a preliminary skimming is very important. But if it is something quite short, you scan it in one search. The next thing you do is you read the question very, very, very carefully, because you need to be doubly sure that, is this what I'm looking for? Is this what the question is asking me to search for? Then you go back to the text and you let your eyes go up and down, back and forth until you've found what it is you're looking or searching for. And once you've found it, read 1 or 2 sentences before that and 1 or 2 sentences after that. This is very, very important because you really want to know that what you have searched for matches with what the question is asking you to look for. And a lot of students, I'm sure, would agree, you would agree, that in haste, in this whole hurry to look for the real word, for the word that the question is asking for, they might go and hunt for something that's completely unrelated to the question. So there are 2 or 3 activities that I quite like doing with students, but if there is anything else that you think works for your students, please share it on the chat box so we can all learn from each other. One activity that I like to do is where before I give a text, a reading passage to students, I write a couple of words, or I call out words from the text to my students, and they have to race with each other and find that word in the text. And once they found it, they circle it or they underline it. And it's a fun way to help them scan and help them not read word for word. And if they're racing, like I've mentioned, they will be trying to get to the word at the quickest. You could also get them to scan for specific word types from the text, say a color or a number or an adjective. And this works beautifully for young learners, say class 4 and 5 students or class 6 as well. And they would want to look for these words in the text. Identifying collocations will also work if you want to practice scanning with your students. So when they are given a text, they have to look for the collocation that you have chosen for them, and they quickly go and look for it in the text and again discuss it with you, discuss the meanings and the nuances of the collocation from the text. This actually helps them to not just learn new vocabulary, but also to be able to scan it effectively. So coming to reading across paragraphs or careful reading, this is your final tool to get or understand the macro structure understanding of an expository text. And this is a very useful subskill, and it helps you to answer questions like selecting true and false questions, or gap fills, or completing summary notes. So paragraphs are like building blocks, and each paragraph has its own main idea. When you read across paragraphs, it helps you to connect the main idea of the paragraph with the overarching main idea. Now, there are 3 things that reading across paragraphs help you to do. It helps you kill 3 birds with 1 stone. Let's see what it is. The first thing that it helps us to do is to distinguish between main idea and supporting ideas and make a connection between paragraph level main idea and text level main idea. It also helps you to distinguish between facts and opinions. So facts are what can be proven to be correct. Opinions are the writer's take, the writer's subjective thoughts and ideas. Now, sometimes it's quite easy to spot opinions in a text if it's explicitly stated. So the writer may introduce sentences like, in my opinion, or according to me, or I think, or through modal verbs like should, would, could, etc. So when we teach our students to distinguish between facts and opinions, you're not just teaching them a reading skill, you're teaching them life skills. Because in today's world, more than ever before, our students, our learners, our young students are exposed to facts, exposed to information that almost always masquerades as facts when it could only be a writer's opinion. So if you introduce these from a very young age, it will go a long way for them to recognize that not everything they see is a fact. Now, the third thing that careful reading helps you to do is to make inferences based on what is not stated. So what it means is that it's impossible for a writer or an author to include everything in a reading passage. He or she would expect the reader to join the dots or to read between the lines. So when you read across paragraphs or when you deploy careful reading, it helps you to see inferences, both statements that are explicitly stated and also the ones that are suggested or implied. Now, what careful reading actually is a slightly higher order thinking skill, but it's not as though it cannot be taught to lower level learners. And the most basic way to do it is by highlighting text. Now, it may look like a very simplistic tool, but when you're asking your students to highlight certain parts of the text, you're actually giving them a visual clue to see how certain items in the text are connected to each other. So what you could do is, now we know what happens when we ask our students to highlight text. They will maybe highlight every word in the text and make it a work of art. So what you could do is instead ask them to discuss why they have highlighted certain parts of the text. So when they talk about it, why they have discarded some parts of the text and why they've chosen some parts to highlight, they're actually talking through the reading process, and that's more effective than just discussing a question and answer in a reading task. If you're in a face-to-face classroom, you can ask your students to highlight using a regular highlighter, but in an online platform, it's just as easy. Pretty much every online platform has its annotations, so you could just maybe share your screen and then you click on the dots on the right-hand side, and the toolbar gives you a whole lot of options: circle, underline, highlight, the works. So this is not just having fun with the text. It is actually, when you ask your students to highlight, they're developing bottom-up processes of prioritizing information and selecting information, selecting key language. So for trainers and teachers who are teaching students, training students for ISE, you would know that ISE allows candidates to highlight text. And this is because we really want students to be able to identify language and prioritize language and information. Right, so coming to other activities to practice careful reading or reading across paragraphs, you could do a jigsaw text. So you cut a paragraph into smaller bite-sized sections, and you ask your students to arrange these paragraphs to lay it out in a sequence. Again, this is tricking them into reading across paragraphs, because in order to be able to lay it out sequentially, you will need to read across paragraphs and deploy careful reading. You could do a title or a summary exercise like we did in Skimming. So they have to come up with a title no longer than 5 words or a summary no longer than 2 sentences. And this, like I've mentioned before, will give them a better connection of the paragraph level main idea with the overarching main idea. I don't know if it is, if you face this problem, but in my experience, students struggle with summaries and they don't like writing summaries. So you could maybe take the help of something called textcompactor.com. It's an online summarization tool. So you copy the text onto the software and you choose the number of words you want the summary for, and you get a computer-generated summary. Now, the catch is, it's after all a machine-generated summary. So you could make this an exercise and you can ask your students, so this is what the computer has come up with. Can you better this summary? Is there something that you want to add to this? Is there anything that you want to leave out? Or you could maybe ask them to work in pairs and they have to guess which summary has been written by the computer and which one has been written by their friends. So this is definitely something that is more fun than just writing a summary in a regular classroom. Another activity, which is my absolute favorite, I am partial to this activity because it's very useful, listing down facts and opinions in a text. So if it is a young learners that you're dealing with, maybe you could start off by giving them a text with explicit bias, where the writer's opinions are very explicitly mentioned in, say, in my opinion or according to me. And also the facts, the ones that can be proven to be correct, and students can work in pairs or in groups and let them have more awareness of these from a very young age. When it comes to true and false, I really think that it's better if you don't give them the answers right there. So this is true or that is false. What you could do instead is get them to highlight certain parts of the text that show or that lead them to the answer. So maybe you could model it. So they see your thinking process, what makes you come to that conclusion, and then they replicate it. So they can again work in pairs. And when they discuss why they're highlighting certain parts of the text, they will actually be talking through the process that leads them to that conclusion. And this is, again, very, very effective. Try this out if you've not done already. Alternatively, you could also get them to come up with their own true and false questions. So they frame true and false questions for their group or for their partners. And in order to come up with true and false questions, they're encouraged to read the text carefully. They are encouraged to read across paragraphs. Right, so coming to multi-text reading, for those of you who are training your students for ISE, you would know that this may at times be a slightly challenging task. It doesn't have to be challenging, but there is a whole lot of materials available on our website, on the Trinity website. There are sample multi-text tasks, there are sample activities that you could do with your students. But it's not that you can't do it on your own. You could design your own multi-text reading tasks. So you could take the help of your students. They can choose what theme they want to read on. So they could choose something or different themes, not just one theme. So they could maybe select a theme like lockdown memories or advertising and media or the environment or slightly abstract topics or slightly simple topics based on what level they're at. And then they go back and hunt for different kinds of articles on social media or magazines or on from newspapers, and they bring it back to the classroom. And they have to maybe do it in pairs or in groups and identify and compare the differences in the structures of the text that they have read. They will also have to do a facts and opinions check on the text. So this becomes quite relevant when they're doing a multi-text task, because each text will have its own, every writer will have their own bias. And it's quite fun to come to a conclusion about which is a fact and what is an opinion in those texts. The third thing that you could do with maybe your B1 or B2 learners is give them slightly more complex text where the writer's bias is not explicitly mentioned, and they have to read between the lines in order to get to the implicit bias in the reading text. If you want to teach multi-text online, you could work with breakout rooms. So you could give maybe split up your class into two, and one half goes to breakout room 1 and the other half goes to breakout room 2. And each room gets two different kinds of text, like you can see on the screen. So one half gets maybe text 1, which is a description of a hotel in a brochure. And text 2 is what breakout room 2 students get, and this is a review of a hotel. And then students from room 1 will have to interview students from room 2 and ask them what their text is about. Or you could give them these questions and they ask their peers, what is your reading passage about? Would you stay in that hotel based on the review that you've read? Why not? What is the writer's opinions, etc. And then they reconstruct the text. They can do it orally, or they can write something based on their reconstruction. And they also swap the text. So if you need more help with breakout rooms, or if you want to know more about breakout rooms, you could go to our Trinity website, where there is a recording of the Transformative Teachers webinar, where there's a beautiful webinar on how to work with breakout rooms. So if you really think you need help with that. Now, we've almost come to the end of this webinar, but I'd like to share a few more tools with you that I found quite useful that our colleagues from Trinity College London have shared with us in previous webinars. So one is commonlit.org. This is perfect for B1 and B2, but you can also use it for other levels because it's got a whole bunch of beautiful reading passages according to different levels. And the best thing about it is not just the different genres available, but the fact that it also comes with lots of support activities. So for every reading passage, you've got true and false questions, you've got interactive quizzes, you've got discussion activities. So all you need to do is select a theme, share the screen with your students, and let them have fun with reading. And don't worry about the reading text because they're all vetted, they're all age appropriate, culture appropriate, so you don't have to worry about the content of what they're reading. Another website that I shared in the earlier webinar was dreamreader.net. Beautiful in terms of content, in terms of genres, because you have reading passages which are as diverse as, say, popular culture, pulp fiction, bizarre, and your students are really going to have a lot of fun reading those texts. And again, like commonlit.org, it comes with lots of support activities. So you have reading comprehension, you have discussion activities. And the best thing about this website is you can also ask the website to send you the lesson in PDF, and then you can share it with your students maybe through chat or email as you deem fit. The third is rewordify.com. I like this website because if you're working with a mixed group, mixed ability group, or you're working with different levels, you may not want to use different reading texts all the time. You want to use the same reading text for all your students, but you know that some students might struggle with it because the language is a little more difficult. So Rewordify does, what it does is it literally rewordifies or simplifies the text for you. So you paste the reading passage onto the software and it simplifies parts of the text. So you can work with the same text for all your learners. So that brings me to the end of this webinar. But before I finish, let me also take you through the Trinity College London website for ISE, which is a treasure trove of activities and exercises and different kinds of reading passages that you can use. And this is not just for teachers who are training students for ISE. Anybody can use it. So all you need to do is select the level that you're going for. The links are available. You choose what kind of activity that you want to do. It could be a long reading, it could be a multi-text reading, and you've got enough and more resources to last for quite an entire, maybe an entire lesson or an entire class. So they're all free, they're all downloadable. Have a look at it, and I hope it helps you. So thank you so much, and I hope to see you again for the next webinar.